Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome this morning on behalf of the Office of Public Affairs of the Baha'i Community of Canada to this webinar today. As we're waiting for a few more people to join, we'll just give it maybe another half minute or so. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land we are hosting from today, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation in Ottawa. As we discuss the intersection of women's rights and religious freedom in Iran today, we can also recognize histories of injustice wherever we are, as the pursuit of human dignity is a shared endeavor across borders. So we're very pleased to have 4 expert speakers with us today to discuss the issue of women's rights and religious freedom in Iran and its implications for the broader human rights context. My name is Rhonda Gosselin, and I will be the moderator today. And we have with us Nazanin Afshin-Jam MacKay, a human rights activist based in Canada, Fernand de Varennes, the former UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, Michael Page, the Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa for Human Rights Watch, and Elham Seddigh Ayafor, the Director of Government Relations for the Baha'i Community of Canada. A very warm welcome to all of you, and we're very excited to hear from you today. I'd just like to say a couple of words before I turn it over to the speakers. A little over a year ago, in March 2024, the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Iran presented its reports to the Human Rights Council on the protests that began in Iran in September 2022 and the women life freedom movement that followed. The fact-finding mission found that gender intersected with discrimination based on ethnicity and religion, and that human rights violations disproportionately impacted women, children, and members of ethnic and religious minorities. It also found, among many other things, that accountability remains elusive in Iran. Our discussions today will delve into why the intersectionality of these two things is important. We will also address why this should matter to international actors like Canada. I hope today we are able to identify some concrete steps and policy recommendations for Canada and international actors, as well as for individuals in civil society, to respond effectively. At a time when some key actors are taking a step back from global leadership on human rights, Canada is stepping up on the world stage, so this discussion could not be more timely. Following our presentations of the speakers, we will have a Q&A session, so please put your questions in the chat for the moderator, myself, to address to the speakers, and we hope to wrap up today by 11:30. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Nazanin Afshin-Jam MacKay. Nazanin is an international human rights and democracy activist, author, public speaker, and co-founder of Stop Child Executions, and more recently, the Iranian Justice Collective. She holds a BA in International Relations and Political Science from the University of British Columbia, the Sciences Po in Paris, and the International Studies Centre in the UK, as well as a master's degree in Diplomacy and International Conflict Management from Norwich University in Vermont, and an honorary Doctor of Law from the University of Western Ontario. After her BA, she became a global youth educator with the Red Cross on humanitarian issues of landmines, children affected by war, and the poverty disease cycle. In 2023, she won Miss Canada and came first runner-up at Miss World, which provided the platform she sought to raise awareness and funds for charitable organizations. In 2006, Nazanin successfully ran an international campaign to save the life of a juvenile sentenced to death in Iran for stabbing a man in self-defense who had tried to rape her. She then co-founded the Stop Child Executions to help put an end to executions of juveniles worldwide. Meanwhile, Nazanin released a multilingual album charting hits in Canada, the US, and Europe. In 2008, she was appointed to the board of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and she is a recipient of several human rights awards of distinction. Finally, she is the author of The Tale of Two Nazanins, published in 2012 by HarperCollins, translated into several languages, and she has committed half of her royalties from the book to anti-violence against women and children. and programs to empower young girls. The funds were allocated via the board of the Nazanin Foundation, registered as a nonprofit charitable organization. Since the spark of the Women Life Freedom Revolutionary Movement in 2022, Nazanin has been dedicating her time to helping advance the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people, and includes the creation of a network of Iranian diaspora groups participating in many national and international campaigns and conferences. Nazanin is married to Canada's former Minister of Foreign Affairs, National Defence and Justice, Peter MacKay, and together they have 3 children. Over to you, Nazanin.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, and thank you to the Baha'i community of Canada for the opportunity to speak on a topic that is needing attention, action, and leadership. And I think Canada can play a big role in this leadership. And thank you, of course, to our guests today that are listening in. When we talk about oppression in Iran, we often discuss the repression of women or the persecution of religious minorities as separate issues. But today, I want us to think about what happens at the intersection of these identities, how they overlap and intensify the experience for the victims or marginalized in question. I want to take you back in time, 2,500 years ago, during the reign of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, who crafted the first charter of human rights the world has ever known. His rule was revolutionary, not only for its time, but even for ours, as different ethnic groups and religions were allowed to live together in peace. Tolerance was not just a principle, it was policy. Women also held important ministerial roles and were heads of the armies and navies. They led, these armies into battle. But history doesn't always move forward. After the Arab conquest of Persia, the spirit of pluralism and women's rights began to fade. Theocratic rule grew stronger, and religion was increasingly used not as a source of personal faith, but as a mechanism of control, including on women. The 19th century poet and Baha'i, Qurrat ul-Ain, saw it clearly. Before she was executed for her beliefs, she famously said, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women." And that fight is still ongoing. And today it's more urgent than ever. In 1979, after the Islamic Revolution, Iran became a state built not on inclusion, but on exclusion. If you're not a 12er Shia Muslim who adheres strictly to the regime's ideology, you're not just an outsider. You are the other, and your life, your rights, and your dignity become conditional. This isn't just societal prejudice. It's systemic. It's legal. It's enforced by an entire apparatus, courts, universities, religious police, media, that exists to keep you in your place. And let me say it plainly, Iran is a gender apartheid state. We've heard Iran and Afghanistan refer to this for several years now, but I would go so far as to say that it is also a religious apartheid state, especially for the Baha'i community, but also for the Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and even Sunni Muslims. Just as South Africa once institutionalized racial apartheid, Iran and Afghanistan have institutionalized religious and gender apartheid. So I believe the world community must follow a similar path in addressing this gender and religious apartheid as it did for South Africa's racial apartheid. Boycott, isolate, delegitimize. Because in order for real change, you need world leaders to have the moral and political will to do something. When the world confronted racial apartheid in South Africa, it didn't look away. It organized. It cut diplomatic ties. It imposed economic sanctions that hurt the apartheid regime where it counted. It passed arms embargoes and halted weapons sales. Artists refuse to perform. Athletes refuse to play. Scholars refuse to collaborate. And most importantly, world leaders called apartheid by its name and refused to normalize it. So I ask you, why should gender and religious apartheid be treated with any less urgency? Women in Iran are jailed, tortured, raped, even killed for showing a strand of hair. Their life is worth half a man under the law. Their testimony in court is worth half of a man's. They need permission from their male relatives to obtain the right to travel. They don't have the same rights in marriage, in custody, in divorce, and are not even allowed to ride a bicycle. Baha'is are denied education, employment, or even burial rights. Christians and Jews are monitored and silenced. And then the regime's laws make all of this perfectly legal. If the world was willing to stand up against apartheid once, it must do it again. So what must the international community, what should they do now? Thankfully, we shut down the Islamic Republic's embassy in Ottawa. However, we must also cut diplomatic niceties. Stop pretending this regime represents its people, because it doesn't. 80% of Iran's population don't just want reform, they want a complete change of regime, a free and democratic Iran. We're asking for you to impose targeted sanctions, not on Iranians, but on the officials, judges, and institutions that uphold this system. End all negotiations that give legitimacy to a regime that has murdered its own children in the street and still carry out child executions. In fact, during the Woman Life Freedom Revolutionary Movement, 71 children were killed on the streets indiscriminately. If there are any negotiations at all, at least human rights must be at the center as a caveat. Otherwise, no talks should resume. Support our grassroots civil society. Fund and elevate the voices of Iranian women, minorities, and human rights defenders in exile and at home. This includes offering more spaces for truly deserving Iranian refugees in Canada through their Protect Defenders program. There's a very limited number and it's spread across different nations, but we're asking to increase that amount. Helping funding internet capacity and VPNs through groups like Toronto-based Siphon and many other Iranian diaspora groups. Rhonda mentioned that I facilitate a network of 100 Iranian diaspora groups that have incredible campaigns on the go and could do so much good with grassroots democracy capacity building with proper funding. And I'd be happy to connect any interested parties. One example that I encourage everyone to get involved in is joining the End Gender Apartheid campaign. You can find it at www.endgenderapartheid.today. You can sign our petitions. And for the members of parliament and policymakers in this room, I highly encourage you to push Canada to have gender apartheid as part of the UN's Draft Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. There will be a preparatory committee for the 6th committee in January 2026. And this is when countries will need to discuss how negotiations for the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty will go. And we want all countries to raise gender apartheid there. And Canada has not yet done so. So it could really be a wonderful thing if they could be forward leaning on this. And finally, be morally consistent. If we're condemning apartheid in South Africa, I really hope we can condemn it in Iran. And let's remember what sparked the most recent uprising, the murder of Jina Mahsa Amini by the so-called morality police. That fire, the Woman Life Freedom movement, brought millions into the streets. Over 20,000 were arrested. Over 600 people were killed. Hundreds were blinded, raped, and tortured. And today, executions are on the rise. 900 people just last year alone were executed, many convicted in sham trials for crimes that you wouldn't even call crimes here. All this, including the systematic discrimination of women, was reported in the UN's independent fact-finding mission on Iran, where they also concluded Iran had committed crimes against humanity. There are many Iranian women on death row in Iran as we speak just because of their activism. And still, the world talks of diplomacy, including our American neighbors south of the border, who are making deals as we speak. Was all that sacrifice for nothing? Iranians are not asking for pity. They are asking for solidarity and support and leadership. And I think Canada could play an important role in putting an end to gender apartheid in Iran, just as Brian Mulroney, our former prime minister, played a critical role in ending racial apartheid in South Africa when he challenged Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher to get on board with calling for sanctions and not just constructive engagement. This is not just Iran's struggle. I think it's a test for the world. Do we stand by the human rights and values that we hold so highly and so dearly here in Canada? Freedom is not a Western ideal, it's a human right. And justice delayed, especially for women, for minorities, for the persecuted, is justice denied everywhere. So thank you for your listening to my remarks, and I'm happy to answer questions coming up.
Thank you so much, Nazanin. Very wonderful start to this. The context, including some historical context on Iran, is fascinating, and introducing the gender apartheid concept, which indeed has helped focus a lot of the discussions, particularly on women's rights in Iran and Afghanistan these days. It's a very interesting discussion that's been taken to the level of UN international bodies and keeping human rights at the center of negotiations. Thank you so much. We will come back to you with questions. I'm going to introduce now the next speaker, Elham Seddigh Ayafor. Elham is the Director of the Government Relations for the Baha'i Community of Canada based in Ottawa. She's a graduate of the University of Ottawa in computer engineering. She has a diverse career history, including managerial roles and government work. And Elham advocates at the national level for Baha'is facing state-sponsored religious persecution in other countries, collaborating with government officials and parliamentarians. She was born in Nigeria to Iranian parents and educated internationally. She values diversity and understands immigration complexities. With that very short introduction, I'll turn it over to you, Elham.
Thank you so much. Very honored to be on this panel with you all this morning. And I'm grateful to be speaking on this urgent and important topic. In my remarks, I will focus on the intersection between women's rights and religious freedom by highlighting the experience of the Baha'i women in Iran. Their stories illustrate how layered systems of discrimination intensify when gender, faith collide, and why this intersectional oppression demands sustained attention. To be a woman in Iran is to face tightly policed boundaries in all areas of life, in education, expression, employment, and personal freedom. To be a Baha'i in Iran is to be criminalized for your beliefs. But to be a Baha'i woman, a mother, a teacher, a writer, a contributor to society in myriad ways, is to face a uniquely targeted form of repression. Every one of your roles becomes a reason to silence you. Let's take a step back. After the 1979 revolution, the newly formed Islamic Republic of Iran began a systematic effort to eliminate the Baha'i community as a functioning group. More than 200 Baha'is were executed in the 1980s, homes were burned, cemeteries desecrated, individuals disappeared, and their families still do not know what happened to this day. In his final report in July 2024, the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran described this campaign as revealing an intent to commit genocide. As international pressure mounted, the Iranian government shifted its tactics. The persecution became less visible, but more deeply embedded. A 1991 confidential memorandum signed by the Supreme Leader and later exposed by the UN outlined a strategy to block the progress and development of the Baha'i community, denying access to education, banning public employment, increasing surveillance, the idea to confront and destroy their cultural roots outside the country, and more. This shift set the stage for the more subtle but persistent forms of persecution Baha'i women face today. Now, it's critical to note the Baha'i community holds no political ambitions, participates in no partisan activity, and is committed to nonviolence. Its only aim is to contribute constructively to the progress and well-being of Iranian society. In December 2024, 18 UN Special Procedure experts issued a joint press release titled "Experts Alarmed at Systematic Targeting of Baha'i Women," following a formal letter of allegation to the Iranian government. The experts noted that Baha'i women are being targeted through arrests, summoning for interrogation, enforced disappearance, raids on homes, confiscation of personal belongings, limitations on freedom of movement, and prolonged consecutive deprivations of liberty. They further reported Baha'i women comprise 2/3 of all Baha'i prisoners in Iran, with many held without due process and with their whereabouts unknown. They also warned, in the broader context of gender inequality in Iran, this rise in the persecution of Baha'i women represents an alarming escalation, affecting a group of people facing discrimination both as women and as members of a religious minority. In a separate report titled "The Boot on My Neck," released in April 2024, Human Rights Watch has gone further, stating the persecution of Baha'is in Iran rises to the level of crimes against humanity of persecution. My colleague Michael on this panel will speak more to that. In this brief talk, I'll touch on 6 areas where this intersectional oppression plays out as an illustration. Education, service and motherhood, arbitrary arrest and excessive bail, economic exclusion, psychological pressure on families. So, related to education. Women in Iran already face gendered restrictions in education, limitations on certain fields of study, and social pressure to prioritize domestic roles. Yet, despite this, women continue to pursue higher learning and academic excellence. For Baha'i women, however, access is blocked entirely. A 1991 policy bars all Baha'is from attending public universities. In 2006, the Ministry of Science reaffirmed this by instructing 81 public universities to expel students identified as Baha'is. Even outside formal institutions, Baha'i women who educate themselves or others are punished. Take a Baha'i woman in Gilan in 2024. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison with 5 years of deprivation of social rights. Her intellectual and spiritual contributions were treated as a crime. She had written a book in 1991 about the history of the Baha'i faith in Gilan. The contribution to that discourse was a threat. Consider a Baha'i woman in Qaim Shahr in 2025. She was sentenced to 10 months in prison for educational activities contrary to Islamic principles. Her crime? She was hosting exam sessions in her home for young Baha'is barred from university, helping them continue their studies. Her house was violently raided by 15 security agents who seized books, laptops, study materials, targeting not just her, but the students she was supporting. These cases show that for Baha'i women in Iran, education, whether sought or shared, is framed as subversive, and they're punished not only for developing their own minds, but for nurturing others. Let's consider service and motherhood. In Iran, women's leadership outside of state-approved roles is discouraged, but Baha'i women face criminal charges simply for serving their communities. Anisa Fanayan, a mother of two, is currently serving a 7-year sentence, her second prison sentence during her children's lifetime. Her recent offense, tutoring Afghan refugee children. She and a friend drove them to school, helped them with books, and supported their education. She was charged with propaganda against the regime and disrupting national security. Before entering prison, she wrote to her children, and this is an excerpt. You may ask why we are being punished like this. It is because we are Baha'is and we believe that God created all people equal. An excerpt from a letter to the Afghan children she was helping. She wrote, "To know is the most essential human need, more important even than food or water. The pain of discrimination I saw in your eyes, I know that pain. To serve, to mother, to uplift others as a Baha'i woman is framed as criminal. Let us discuss arbitrary arrest and excessive bail. Across Iran, women activists are frequently surveilled and detained. For Baha'i women, arbitrary arrest is a routine and systemic tool of repression. A 2024 UN letter of allegation detailed multiple cases of Baha'i women arrested without warrants, often held without clear charges or legal representation. And when Baha'i women are arrested, the bail amounts set are exorbitant, not designed to ensure court appearance, but to financially destabilize families. Take the case of two Baha'i women from Mashhad. In 2023, both were interrogated and then released on bail, set at 5 billion Tuman each. That is equivalent to 1.7 million Canadian dollars per person. Despite the fact that on appeal they were acquitted of the main charge, they are now serving 8 months for the remaining charge of propaganda against the regime. This case reveals how the justice system is not merely punitive, but financially coercive, weaponizing the cost of freedom. Moving on from that, we can discuss economic exclusion. Women across Iran face barriers to employment, including needing spousal permission in some contexts. Baha'i women are explicitly banned from public sector jobs, and their private businesses are subject to closure. Just last month, a Baha'i woman who ran a fabric shop closed for a Baha'i holy day. It's within her legal right to take 15 days off annually. Her shop was shut down. This is not religious discrimination. It is an attempt to erase economic self-reliance. Looking at psychological and familial pressure. Many Iranian women carry the emotional burden of holding families together under pressure. For Baha'i women, the state directly targets their families. Their homes are raided, their children expelled, their spouses are arrested, their entire household is viewed as suspect. Let me share an example of a mother. She was on trial when her son, a young adult son, sitting quietly in the courtroom, was suddenly named as a co-defendant. Without interrogation or due process, both were sentenced for so-called educational activities. A mother punished, her son punished for being raised by her. Or take the case of a young Baha'i mother. In 2023, she tried to secure a proper burial for her grandmother after Tehran's main cemetery refused to release her remains. It was part of a broader effort to deny families the right to bury their loved ones in dignity. For this act of mourning and protest, she was sentenced to 5 years in prison for membership in an illegal group. Thus a reference to her religious identity. She was sent to Evin prison, separated from her 5-year-old child, simply for honoring her grandmother. These are not isolated tragedies. They reflect a systemic attempt to break families, to intimidate future generations, to criminalize not just life, but death. Much of the information I've shared today is drawn from the Archives of Baha'i Persecution in Iran website. It's an extensive and growing online collection of official documents, verified reports compiled by the Baha'i international community. It includes court filings, state directives, and personal testimonies, and currently holds over 10,000 documents. I hope that I've given a glimpse of what intersectionality looks like in Iran. To be a woman in Iran is to be restricted. To be a Baha'i is to be excluded. To be both is to be targeted and punished. Not for what you do, but for who you are. And yet Baha'i women continue to write, serve, teach, and mother with dignity. Their oppression is systematic, and their stories must be central to how we understand human rights in Iran and how we act. While I focus today on the experience of Baha'i women, the targeting of individuals on the basis of their religion or belief is not limited to one community. As seen with Christians, Gonabadi dervishes, Jews, Sunni Muslims, Zoroastrians, among others. In highlighting one struggle, we are also calling for a future where no one is punished for their beliefs, where dignity and freedom are upheld for all. The increased targeting of Baha'i women is not isolated. It reflects the broader reality that all Iranians are engaged in the same struggle for equality, justice, and freedom. As the campaign Our Story Is One so powerfully expresses, the persecution of Baha'is in Iran is not a separate story. It is a chapter in the same book of Iran's movement toward gender equality and social transformation. This story of sacrifice and resilience has a vision for a new Iran, one in which all people, regardless of faith, background, or gender, can live with dignity and prosper together. Thank you.
Thank you, Elham. That was wonderful to end with a different vision of Iran. And I appreciated also a historic look at the systemic persecution and the change in strategy of the regime over many years. And it was wonderful to hear the stories of the women that you presented. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Fernand de Varennes. Fernand was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues between August 2017 and November 2024. He is currently visiting professor at the Université Catholique de Lyon in France and of the University of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and sits on the advisory boards of research and civil society organizations such as the Club de Madrid, the International Communities Organization, the European Centre on Minority Issues, and the Experts Committee of the British Standing Group on Atrocity Crimes. He is renowned as one of the world's leading experts on the human rights of minorities and the prevention of ethnic conflicts. He has been awarded prizes for his work and commitment to human rights, including the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, the 2004 Lingopa Award from Spain, and was nominated in 2004 for the Guangzhou Prize for Human Rights. As a researcher and legal expert on human rights and international law, he has some 300 publications worldwide in more than 30 languages. So, very happy to have you. Over to you, Fernand.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. Merci beaucoup. Distinguished speakers, honorable members of parliament and representatives, mesdames et messieurs, bonjour tout le monde, salam. Woman, life, freedom. We're all familiar with this movement and slogan following the 2022 death of Mahsa Amini after her arrest by the religious morality police for not properly wearing the hijab. But there's another often forgotten side to her story. The mistreatment and fate of Mahsa Amini were not only linked to her gender. She was also Kurdish, member of the Sunni religious minority. And therefore, being a minority, a religious minority, where the Shia faith is not only the dominant and official religion of the state and the majority, but where the conduct of state authorities, their preferences and even bias weigh heavily on those of a different faith. Now, my distinguished colleagues on this panel have already described more eloquently than I could some of the lived experiences of religious minority women, such as Baha'i and others. But let me emphasize the double burden that religious minority women in Iran must often carry, and why they are particularly at risk and vulnerable too, from an international human rights point of view. And this is because women from minority backgrounds in Iran face the double discrimination of being a woman, but also of belonging to a marginalized and even despised minority. When gender discrimination overlaps with religious discrimination and intolerance, targeting specific minorities, you have a risk of overlapping and compounding, of combining to create, in some contexts, and at times objectivizing of minority women, or them becoming an easier lightning rod for some of the worst prejudices and abuses. As a matter of fact, as we've heard just a few months ago, United Nations Special Rapporteurs, former colleagues of mine, issued a press release expressing alarm at the systematic targeting of Baha'i women, pointing out that they comprise 2/3 of all Baha'i prisoners in Iran, clearly and obviously so disproportionately targeted and impacted. Woman, life, freedom. The life and freedom of women who are members of religious minorities can be more easily the targets of persecution and abuse because of the compounding effects of discrimination and justice, where, as in Iran, you have extreme majoritarian nationalism, and in this case, with a pronounced religious dimension that fails to uphold basic precepts of morality and justice that are represented by human rights. And this must be understood in the broader context also. First, Iran can be considered to be amongst the world's worst countries, or having the worst treatment of religious minorities, particularly those who are not recognized or protected under the Constitution, especially Baha'is, as we've heard, but also atheists and followers of non-traditional faith, or people who have converted away from Islam. Just a few weeks ago, some of you may be familiar with the 2025 annual report of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and it recommended that Iran be designated as a country of particular concern. And that means one of the world's worst in terms of, because of its involvement in systematic and ongoing violations of religious freedom. And this means, and we have to be clear, particularly religious freedom of minorities and women. And what has been happening in Iran for decades is really deeply ingrained, as we just heard, deeply ingrained in the national laws and the policies, the preferences and practices. None of this is accidental, it is intentional. And all of this which violates the rules of international human rights law. And I think perhaps maybe it would be good to summarize very quickly with the description from last year's report from the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I quote, gross human rights violations were committed alongside unlawful death, extrajudicial executions, unnecessary, disproportionate use of lethal force, arbitrary arrest, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, enforced disappearances, and gender persecution. The mission found that many of these violations amounted to the crimes against humanity of murder, imprisonment, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence. And that this was directed against a civilian population, widespread and systematic, namely women, girls, and others expressing support for human rights. Women belonging to ethnic and religious minorities were subjected to particularly brutal acts, including gang rape and rape with an object, in acts also amounting to torture. And to be very clear and perhaps specific, in one example, a woman who was arrested in one province by plainclothes officers in late 2022 described how officers mocked her physical appearance, ridiculed her faith, and interrogated her. The security officers also questioned why she thought she deserved respect, given that she belonged to a particular minority. She was raped and then thrown out on the street, blindfolded. End of quote. Woman, life, freedom. The list goes on and on. Minority women are not only denied periodically their human rights, their dual marginalization is the result of a state, a government, a system where discrimination against them are deeply ingrained in government and all levels of administration, to the extent that they are disproportionately impacted and treated doubly unequally and doubly vulnerable. And it's here that the whole international community, including the political leadership in other countries that are democracies and respectful of human rights standards, must also redouble efforts to redress and improve as much as we can what has long been condemned since the end of the Second World War, where we all committed to never again allowing the atrocities and horrors which were committed against religious minorities during the Shoah and the Holocaust. Let us remember that. There were lessons that from which the United Nations and the whole international system of rules of human rights obligations emanate from. And that is that commitment not to repeat the horrors that were committed against religious minorities under the National Socialist regime of bias against minorities. And that is why political and other leaders adopted about 80 years ago the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and established a global rule of law based on human rights, which unfortunately remain incomplete. And I think we need to acknowledge, as shown in the case of what's happening in Iran, need of reform and improvement in order to address the rising hate and discrimination against minorities worldwide, including, as we've been talking about, minority women in Iran in particular. So what the world needs now, more than ever, is not just outrage at the treatment of Baha'is or Baluch or Kurds or Christian minority women and girls in Iran or Saudi Arabia or India and so on. What we need are steps that could be taken beginning here in Canada, but also globally, that can be maybe summarized in 3 words: information, education, protection. At the national level, a parliamentary hearing on religious freedom and women's rights in Iran should be held to supplement and build upon the more general hearing that we had in Parliament in 2023. And this could be convened in order to directly raise and consider given the evolving, even degrading situation, more concrete responses, including, for example, among these, how to prioritize a legal pathway that persecuted religious minorities and especially women from Iran could be protected and perhaps resettled in Canada. And perhaps to be a bit more controversial, instead of excluding Iran from various UN or international forums, Canada should step up, take a leadership role, and mobilize other countries or collaborate with other countries to defend and reform the international human rights multilateral system and make it more effective for the most vulnerable, such as minority women in Iran and elsewhere. And ironically, this specific area is largely omitted, even now, because the UN system needs to be strengthened in terms of the human rights protection for minorities in particular. And I would say religious minorities and women, who are doubly targeted. So Global Affairs Canada should, as a priority, perhaps a new priority of the new government, should, as a priority, have the goal of working with a core group of countries, Switzerland, Norway, Brazil, and many others, to drive the protection, to lead the drive to protect minority women and others as part of the new draft treaty on the human rights of minorities, because right now this is not well understood. It is not sufficiently focused and addressed. And I think that that is the kind of direction that we need to strengthen, to educate, to raise awareness, and to better protect those who need it most in this case, especially minority women and who are in Iran and other countries. So having a new treaty on these rights would support, perhaps would raise awareness and focus at the United Nations on a continuous basis, which needs to be addressed. Additionally, well, Canada could raise, propose, and support the creation of a new special procedure, a special rapporteur on atrocity crimes, while we wait for a treaty, which in this area, which could be able to more systematically and consistently document and address globally situations such as those as we've been describing for today. A lot can be done beginning here in Canada, and we should be leaders rather than followers in this area. Woman, life, freedom. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you so much, Fernand. Very concrete recommendations for policymakers that came out of this, a lot to think about and to go back to in our questions. Thank you. So our last speaker today is Michael Page. Michael is the Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. He is a graduate of the American University of Beirut and the Harvard Kennedy School. He previously worked closely with civil society organizations in the Middle East, including on the documentation of human rights abuses during the Syrian conflict. He supervises Human Rights Watch work on several countries, including Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, and Egypt. Welcome, Michael. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, and thank you so much to all these distinguished speakers. It's an honor to be part of this panel, and it's an obligation, I think, given that I'm the last speaker, to be the briefest after following all of this eloquence and expertise. I think what I would like to do with my remarks is the following. I would like to talk a little bit about the reasons behind why Human Rights Watch put out a report last year around the crime of persecution against Baha'is by Iranian authorities, and specifically, what are the legal arguments that we're making? So I want to talk about the uniqueness of it. And then I also want to just very briefly, because other speakers have done this so well, talk about the commonalities, because unfortunately, Baha'is are a group that is persecuted by Iranian authorities, but they're not the only group that has faced brutal repression from the government. And then I would like to take this together and maybe talk, what are some broader policy ideas that we might be able to apply in Canada or in other countries to try to have, some pressure on Iranian authorities? And what's the logic of going abroad instead of pushing for accountability and justice within Iran? And I think there's an obvious question, but I think it's useful to kind of spell out. So I think the first point to note is, we as Human Rights Watch produced this report on the crime against humanity of persecution against Baha'is in Iran, and we're basing it off a legal kind of determination. There's a descriptive use of a word like persecution, but persecution also has a legal definition that is, embedded in the 1998 Rome Statute. And the Rome Statute founded the International Criminal Court, which came into effect in 2002. And so the Rome Statute lays out 11 crimes that can amount to a crime against humanity. And it does so, or it comes to effect when these crimes are carried out as a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population with knowledge of the attack. So let's just break that down, because what other speakers have noted really kind of lays out just kind of how clear-cut, this argument is in terms of persecution of Baha'is. So, in this note is that, at its first part is that the Iranian government, through its own policy and memorandum, and especially, since 1991, in which it's essentially codified, in the Supreme Religious Council kind of documentation, saying that there is a intent and policy to, quote unquote block the progress, of Baha'is across Iran, right? So, government and state policy is probably unambiguously clearest against any other kind of minority group in which the government, has clearly noted from its founding, kind of, identifying Baha'is as a group to be kind of targeted with a widespread and systematic attack. And we can see this over decades as part of a plan. And Elham has very eloquently kind of put this kind of into kind of categories on education, on land confiscation by authorities, on, a total lack of freedom of religion, of an intersectional targeting of Baha'i women and any type of religious leadership. But another way to frame it is essentially Baha'is in Iran, from birth until death, are being targeted by the Iranian state. And I mention death deliberately because even Baha'i graves, are kind of subject to desecration by Iranian authorities that periodically bulldoze them. And so what we have in Iran, what the uniqueness of Baha'is is that the government has specifically kind of set out into policy, which has often been reinforced into a variety of court documents, the kind of targeting, of Baha'is. And so I don't think there's any type of counter argument to ever be made or that Iranian authorities can make, vice versa, because the laws are very clear. To kind of follow up on that. So while there's a uniqueness to the Baha'i case, of persecution, unfortunately, there's also a commonality to it. And so, others have referenced the UN fact-finding mission, in Iran, which has kind of gone on to investigate various crimes that have occurred in the context of the women life freedom movement. And the fact-finding mission, or the FFM, has found that serious crimes, including gender persecution, is also occurring, in Iran and being committed by Iranian authorities. So unfortunately, we have this, repression and persecution of Baha'is, but we also have, likely actual gender persecution that's being carried out against women. And it's something, just as a note, that Human Rights Watch is working in terms of building, a broader argument for, and we hope to kind of release a report, in the coming months. And so not only do we have Baha'is and women, we also see often widespread and patterns of repressions, as Fernand and others have mentioned, against ethnic and religious minorities, right? So we have Kurdish minorities, Baluch, people from the Sunni minority community in which Kurds are a part of, dervishes, all of these groups have faced, pretty brutal repression, and there often seems to be a pattern of particularly a level of violence deployed, particularly in ethnic minority areas, by Iranian authorities. And so we have this commonality of types of different groups face this level of targeting, and of course there's overlaps, right? And the most obvious one for this discussion today is women and Baha'is. And so I think there might be some ideas around what I want to get into is kind of common policy approaches to address this. And I'll just kind of put it in order of kind of lowest to kind of maybe ones that will take a little bit more time. So, number one, I think this is often stated, but I think it's worthwhile in re-emphasizing, which is for Canadian authorities and other governments, it actually does matter to be articulating and calling out these abuses publicly. The Iranian authorities are a very difficult government. It's a brutal autocratic government. They're very hard to advocate with, to move, to persuade, to push. But there is some sensitivity to public international sustained pressure, particularly when there are individual cases that are referenced, and particularly when they are engaging with other states on other interests. So I don't want to dismiss the fact that it's impossible. It is possible, it is difficult, but it is something that is absolutely essential for states to do, including Canadian authorities. Second is human rights sanctions. They are simply one tool but they are an important tool. And I want to reference, specifically the entity, the execution of Imam Khomeini's orders, an entity that has been charged by Iranian authorities to confiscate Baha'i lands and properties and businesses at times. This is something where, at least in European Union jurisdictions, has not been sanctioned, and it's something Human Rights Watch has pushed for sanctioning. I will need to check, in terms of where that sanctions stand in terms of Canadian authorities, but it's something to consider because it's especially important to harmonize the symbolic nature of human rights sanctions and practical implementation. And so it's important. It sends a signal, even if there are not, for instance, funds or finances or other kind of property that execution of Imam Khomeini's orders owns in a place like Canada. It's an important symbolic step to articulate from the Canadian authorities' perspective that we are sanctioning entities and groups in Iran that are linked to serious human rights violations. And then I would say third, I was my colleague had flagged for me, that there was a little bit of controversy in 2021 when a former Iranian IRGC commander, and I believe he was the head of the police chief in Tehran at the time, actually visited Canada in 2021, Murtaza Talayi. Right. And I think there's this question here where there have been individuals, Iranian authorities, who are likely implicated in abuses, but there hasn't been a structure that's built out for structural investigations that prepare the groundwork to ultimately implicate and prosecute individuals by Iranian authorities that are likely involved in crimes. And I think that's something that Canadian authorities and others really need to seriously consider. And I think the note is that there is a huge overlap between individuals who have carried out or overseen crimes against Baha'is, as well as women, ethnic and religious minorities, etc. The overlap is incredibly high. And so considering how that, either through individual accountability or trying to build structural investigations at a national level to address and prepare for individuals who might come into a country like Canada. And I'm not saying he should have been allowed in the first place, but when individuals have visited places like Canada or Germany, simply the groundwork hasn't been prepared to prepare concrete charges against them. And so I think these are kind of three broad ideas in terms of probably level of challenge and difficulty that authorities really need to consider. A last note, and maybe discuss more, but I would just say I think it's an additional insult when individuals such as the person that I referenced are freely in a place like Canada, yet it's incredibly difficult for normal Iranians fleeing repression. And I do want to make the case that, particularly for Baha'is in Iran, it's something where they should be considered upfront as individuals who are being persecuted and who should have support for asylum measures or considered preemptively for asylum. And that's something that we need to seriously take on, particularly in a context where I'm speaking in the US, in New York, where we recognize that the US is not going to be doing its fair share, is restricting, legitimate claims of asylum for many people. And so states like Canada really need to step up. So with that, I really appreciate the time. I think I was a little less than brief, but appreciate the opportunity to speak.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you. And very interesting note to mention the asylum and refugee class potentially for Baha'is. That was very, very useful. I'm going to pose a couple of quick questions and we'll open it up to audience questions. So please put your questions in the chat. Fernand may have to leave a little earlier, so I'd like to address our first question to Fernand before he steps out, and wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on those three steps to be taken that you mentioned, the information, education, protection, and how critical they are. And if you could also maybe just address, is Iran impervious to any kind of statements that are made? Like, how does it really make a difference? Does it matter?
Thank you very much, Rhonda. And I'll begin with the last part of what you just raised. as Michael has just mentioned, it does count. Iran is a difficult government to work with, but at times international pressure and attention can lead to some movement, let's call it that. And so therefore, I think amongst all the tools that we have, one has to make sure the tool of information education, ensuring that issues involving minorities, religious minorities, and women's rights in Iran is still part of the visible actions or activities in Canada and globally are important. So Canada, on the one hand, within our own political system in Parliament, for example, we should raise as much as possible issues involving the human rights of minorities and women in Iran, either through, as I've suggested, a hearing or hearings on a regular basis on these issues. But more than that, and I think it was perhaps, I think all the speakers at one point hinted more or less directly that we in Canada really do have a role to play, a leadership role to play in making sure that the ideas of tolerance, justice, human rights for all are not just slogans, but become part of the global architecture. And if I can actually summarize the leadership, which perhaps in the past was exercised by our neighbors to the south, is not coming out of the south from there anymore. But we should not leave that situation unaddressed. I think Canada can actually be at the top of those countries to make sure that the lessons of the Second World War are not forgotten and that they are there to defend the global architecture of peace, justice, and dignity. And that's why I think we need to, in addition to information, education, and protection, including concerning refugees coming from Iran, Canada can do more and must do more at the global level. And I think, in a sense, this is the main message that we have all been repeating to some degree. I've made some proposals. Perhaps another one could be politically. The Canadian Parliament can establish a group of experts to deal with minority rights areas, human rights areas globally. I think this is lacking. And it is more preventive than perhaps other measures. I think we should prevent atrocities and mass violations of human rights like we have in Iran involving minorities and women and others. But this should be done in a more preventive form internationally, but also in Canada. We could perhaps establish a parliamentary group of experts, for the Canadian Parliament on human rights and minority protection globally, and perhaps develop some kind of approach that to align with and cooperate with many other countries and governments in the world who are sensitive to this area. So I think there are tools available, but more tools that need to be developed, as have been outlined by Nazanin, Elham, also and Michael previously.
Thank you. That's excellent. It's very good to have these concrete policy recommendations to actually work on rather than just, as you say, the slogans. So thank you again very much. If we're not able to get back to you, we very much appreciate you sharing your contacts and that we can follow up with you later and people can follow up also with questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
I wanted to address the issue of sanctions, both to Nazanin and to Michael. You've both spoken about them. Nazanin, maybe you could start here. You mentioned that one solution to address the human rights violations in Iran is through sanctions. Could you elaborate a bit more, and then maybe Michael can also add?
Sure. As I mentioned, the vast majority of Iranians inside Iran are not looking for reforms. For example, if a law was passed today saying women didn't have to wear the hijab anymore, or if they said Baha'is can now have access to higher education, this wouldn't be enough. People want a complete change of regime because without a free democratic Iran with free and fair elections, women, ethnic and religious minorities will never have their fundamental rights. So the best policy is a policy of maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support for the democratic aspirations of the people. Our group, the Iranian Justice Collective, we're on Parliament Hill several times in the past couple of years, meeting with government officials. We pushed for the listing of the IRGC on the terrorist list. We pushed for a unanimous motion to pass the Tumaj sanctions, which consisted of sanctioning 31 officials, judges, and prosecutors involved in the sentencing of the famous Iranian rapper Tumaj Salehi, but also of other innocent victims on death row. We also participated in the national inquiry on transnational repression and seminars with the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation and others, giving our personal testimonies and pushed for Magnitsky sanctions. These were all positive steps, especially when the government finally did list the IRGC on the terrorist list. However, what really matters and needed is enforcement. So under Trudeau's government, they had announced $76 million for sanctions. We did a access to information and learned that only a small fraction was allocated to different departments, but not necessarily spent. And the funding was not restricted just for Iranian issues. So we need these resources allocated to address this problem of keeping dangerous regime officials out and their laundered money out of Canada. We also need to curb the problem of transnational repression, where the regime hires organized crime gangs in Canada to carry out assassinations on not only Canadian soil, but on American soil as well. And they engage in espionage on Iranian dissidents in Canada and harass their family members back in Iran. So we need these funds to educate and properly train our border services, police, and immigration officials. So these are the kinds of sanctions that I'm talking about, very targeted. And what was also mentioned by our guest from Human Rights Watch, sorry, your name is failing me right now. He was mentioning structural investigations. Definitely, this is something that Canada can engage in. We do have universal jurisdiction, so we can try those individuals that have been implicated. I know that Sweden has an example with the case of Hamid Nouri. Unfortunately, later he was exchanged in a prisoner swap. But this is a mechanism that we have in Canada and that we can definitely apply to those regime officials that are currently in our border right now.
Very, very concrete and specific on the accountability angle. Michael?
Nazanin has said it well. I just say, imposing targeted sanctions is, is an important tool. I don't think, a lot of times what we see from sanctions is sanctions are usually, at least recently, applied in a national security context, right? So in Europe, saying that Iranian authorities are, providing drones or something to Russia, but much less often from a human rights context. It's that entities are carrying out abuses against against Iranian people themselves. And so, I think, from our point, where it's outside our mandate about other national geopolitics and national security concerns, but it is a problem that governments aren't applying the kind of human rights standards. And I would also make a note, right? A little bit of editorializing, but I think it's also just basic analysis, is I would not expect much from the US, in this kind of time period, given the trajectory of its foreign policy, right? In which, at minimum, human rights related work more broadly, but also probably including sanctions, is simply something that will be, highly de-emphasized, and that's without any other type of analysis or prediction, which is prediction always, is a dangerous one in the Middle East. So I try to predict nothing, but I would just say, given the US's public stance in terms of this, trying to restart, nuclear deal, I think there's a further worry, and I think we can see some of those concerns from post 2015, in which there's also a slackening or lessening of human rights related sanctions because of a desire maybe not to upset this kind of like a precarious agreement, etc. And from our perspective, it's really important to use human rights sanctions as a tool, as part, but in a series of tools that includes everything from kind of like public rhetoric and articulation and raising cases publicly, particularly those in most urgent need, executions, etc., all the way to developing structural investigations in which you are then building a larger groundwork, particularly since there is a consensus that's developing around crimes against humanity that is targeting multiple populations in Iran, women, Baha'is, perhaps other ethnic and religious minorities. And so that's something that's really important, and that takes time. In Syria, I'll just give one last thing. For Syria, there were structural investigations that were set up, but that was a multi-year process. And it did lead to some, Assad government officials in the intelligence branches being prosecuted in places like Germany that have strong laws. Unfortunately, the Iranian authorities use some pretty brutal tactics, including, kind of blatant hostage-taking attempts, which is what they used, to free Hamid Nouri in a prisoner exchange. But I think it is something where it's an incredibly important kind of tool, especially as others have noted. If Canada wants to live up to its standards and it not just be empty slogans and rhetoric, related to human rights, well, this is a pathway that you can kind of take on, and certainly the lane's open in the Americas, because America is not going to be filling in for the next several years on this issue. Thank you.
Very good points. Elham, I don't know if you want to add anything to this point as well. I'd also like to ask you if you could speak a little bit to how the legal system in Iran is used to legitimize repression, and particularly how they use it to justify the targeting of Baha'i women.
So with respect to the legal framework in Iran that they use to justify the, how did you put it? The targeting of Baha'i women. Well, one thing is specific to the Baha'i community. It is not part of the recognized religions in the Constitution. And so this non-recognition is used within court systems to deny them rights. One example is from in November, a final, on appeal ruling had come out. There was a gentleman who had been executed by somebody for being a Baha'i 11 years prior, and the family had tried to go through the courts to there's a system where you can receive, if you will, blood money if for this kind of thing. It went through appeal. Ultimately, in the final court decision 11 years later, it's clear that the courts were aware of who the individual was who did this. It was clear the motivation of the individual. So it hit all the right boxes of deserving this blood money. However, specifically in that court document, it referenced the Baha'is are not part of Article 13. It's not a recognized religion, and therefore does not deserve this. So this is one way. There is also, I guess, Article 499 and 500 in the Penal Code that punishes religious expression and and extends prison terms in a strong way. And it's been called for appeal because they use this to also punish Baha'is just for living.
Thank you. We have some questions coming up, but I'd like to just take another tack, because I wanted to address an issue that Nazanin had raised, and that is how we should also be supporting grassroots women's organizations in Iran and individuals. And I know some of the questions people have often asked is, as individuals, what can we do? How can we get involved? But then there is this larger issue of how could we possibly support grassroots women's organizations in Iran? If you could address that, Nazanin.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of different Iranian diaspora groups that I've mentioned that I help, facilitate a monthly meeting, and they have these ongoing campaigns that need both volunteers and resources and support. So if there's any individuals that specifically ask that of you, Rhonda, I would love to, be in touch with them and I can help direct them further. But just generally, I guess, depending where you're logging in from, whether it's inside Canada or outside, there are different groups that address women's rights issues, religious minority issues. If you could find out who are the ones that are focusing on this, or you can even just, come onto my social media page and I'm connected with a lot of these groups. You'll see me reposting a lot of their contents, and you can either directly get involved with them, or again, you can use me as a tool to get in touch with them. But there's the End Gender Apartheid campaign, and there's different human rights groups like the Burumand Foundation. There's the International Center for Human Rights in Iran. There's Iran Human Rights that focuses a lot on executions. They're based out of Sweden. There's also a group called Impact Iran. They're a coalition, and under that coalition, there's probably a dozen human rights groups that are on. So if you even just go to the Impact Iran website, you can see what campaigns that are of interest to you and be put in touch there.
Okay, that's really, really helpful. We have another question from the audience, and it's along the lines of the gender apartheid issue. So I'm just going to read it for you. Why do you feel it's important for the Canadian government and other states to be vocal about gender apartheid in this case?
Is this question for me?
To you, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think I mentioned earlier, I mean, women's rights are human rights, and what affects one person affects all of us. And if we're concentrating on upping our human rights generally and globally, then we have to focus on those most vulnerable. And a lot of people think of issues like women's rights in the Middle East as something being so far away, and that doesn't really affect us here in Canada. But it does, because problems that are happening, especially when it comes to the persecution of women, or women that are being treated as second-class citizens, sometimes it appears in our midst here in Canada, and problems get travel here. But not just that, the Islamic Republic of Iran, their whole existence is because of three pillars. One is, anti-American and anti-Israeli sentiment. One is the expansion of their religion, or political Islam, I would say more so, because they don't really practice the faith. And then thirdly is the subjugation of women. And if you take one of those pillars out, you can affect the whole regime. Now, this Islamic Republic regime, they try to propagate their ideology to other countries. And that is why you're seeing the Islamic Republic funding terrorist regimes like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and causing terrorism worldwide. And some of this money even comes back to some of the mosques, madrasas, and Islamic centers in Canada, where they fund people and they propagate hate and other discrimination, and not just sexism, but racism of other religions. And this is something we don't tolerate here in Canada. And we don't want our children influenced by this political Islam or Islamification. I'm not trying to condemn Islam as a religion, but I'm talking about the politicized version and the extremist version that are propagating hate, intolerance, violence. So what affects us, what affects people inside Iran ultimately will affect us here. And with a free and democratic Iran, if we actually put our efforts in putting our resources and our time on helping with grassroots movements inside Iran, that'll help empower the nation to get a free and democratic Iran, and that will bring peace and stability, not just to Iran, but the Middle East region, and ultimately the global world, because it does end up affecting all of us.
Yes, that's a really good point. That sort of what happens in one part of the world also affects us, because many people say, you know, why should we be concerned about this as Canadians, etc. Michael, I was wondering if you might address one of the other questions that came up in the chat about the issue of quiet diplomacy of a country like Canada versus an explicit human rights approach. In cases where an explicit human rights approach in our foreign policy could potentially make things worse for victims. I'm wondering if you might speak to that question.
I'm open, you know, in individual cases that could be in theory the result. I often think it's a justification, because what we're talking about is a preferred strategy to not make it, you know, people's lives as diplomats more difficult, or to harm national interests that people might be pursuing. So I'm pretty skeptical, and working in the region, in the Middle East region for, you know, I guess 15 years or something at this point, and living there, whether it's Iran or other countries, I'm incredibly skeptical of that as a broad kind of approach rather than an exception to the rule. I mean, we could see just even in the execution cases, right, that pressure at certain times when there is an imminent threat of execution of political activists, I really do think that makes a difference, and Iranian authorities react to that. So quiet diplomacy, especially when you don't have like quiet diplomacy in theory, if you are leveraging and putting serious pressure on a government, okay, but usually quiet diplomacy is just an excuse to say, please don't do this, but we're not going to criticize regardless, right? And so I am skeptical with the kind of general approach to it. And plus, like, if we want the slogan of human rights or the rhetoric of human rights to match reality, then we need to see it. You know, we need to be able to see that publicly. So I'm skeptical at a practical level. I'm skeptical as a justification. I'm open to individual cases where there might be something unique and sensitive, etc. But I think kind of in Iran and more broadly, really public pressure is a key, especially since, and I really should have emphasized this at the outset. So one thing that I forgot to mention, the reason for all of these advocacy angles abroad is because for Baha'is, but for pretty much anyone else, there is no route to justice and accountability domestically. And I think that needs to be emphasized, right? Is that there's just no way that people can, achieve justice in Iran as Iranians. And more than that, the families, members, and friends and survivors of abuses often face additional, right? Like there's another wave of repression and threats and intimidation when they try to seek that form of accountability. So I think that needs to be emphasized, and hence governments really need to be public because it is such a threat for families and for loved ones of people who are victims of human rights abuses to do it domestically. People still do it because they're incredibly brave, but it's something where it's something where it's very difficult and risky. And so they could use support from abroad, in these situations rather than quote unquote quiet diplomacy.
That's wonderful, and I think you've given us actually very good justification to think about how he might generate political will to extend Canadian immigration programs to vulnerable Iranian refugees facing religious and gender-based persecution in this case. Well, we're almost out of our time. I might give a chance to anyone to say a last word. Maybe Elham, if you would like to start.
Sure. Thank you, Rhonda. Once again, just thank you so much. I was so honored to be on the panel with you all today, and hope that this has been informative to the audience. I have to say, in developing my talk, I found it challenging as it felt like it was the tip of the iceberg. There's so much I haven't been able to touch on. For example, the violation of burial rights and desecration of graves, intimidation of elderly women, the fact that so many arrested are young women in their 20s and 30s. Some have been in and out of jail literally for their belief alone. The number of years that their lives hang in the balance is in the time period where they're thinking about, should I get married? Should I not? When do I have children? But let's say you're arrested, you're out on bail. How do you make these choices? These are all very real implications to women. What happens to the children when husbands and wives are both in prison at the same time? These are not hypotheticals. These are not anomalies. These are their lived realities. These are the lived realities of these women, and that is shaped by the intersection of persecution of women and religious minorities. I would just end it maybe with a quote from, I referenced Anissa Fanayan had written a letter to her children, and within it she said, Iran is a very beautiful country. Iranians have a lot of abilities. Their nature is wonderful, and we share a great history. I am sure we will have a bright future if we can respect each other. I learned from your grandmother how to be brave, how to be patient, how to be steadfast, and how to think about the needs of others. So as they act to better their country hand in hand with their countrymen, let us do that here. But also, we must be their voices. We should not let Iran act with impunity.
Thank you. Michael or Nazanin, if you'd like to say anything more?
No, I think Elham ended so nicely with the hope, and I just wanted to personally thank Elham for assembling all of us here on matters that really are important, not just for those inside Iran, but for Canadians as well. And I hope some of the policymakers in the room are able to enact some of our suggestions.
Right. And this webinar will be available online. I believe it'll be on a YouTube channel, but we'll get back to you and let you know where it is, or contact us if you need to know where it is. Okay, well, I think we're right on time, and thank you. I mean, certainly I think it's also given us a strong motivation to keep fighting to protect and reform our global human rights architecture and do whatever we can as individuals and working with our governments and collaborators on that. Thank you all for attending, and we'll hope this will be a continued discussion.
Thank you.